Okay, now let's come back to France because it's important we spend a little time in France and see how things are going to happen during this little bit of time here as the neoclassical era and the romantic era are clashing, because they're clashing hard in France, and how that's going to lead toward what will eventually be the modern art movement that we're going to get into in the late 19th century on into the 20th century. Uh, so if we take a look at what's going on in France at this time, France is an empire because Napoleon Bonaparte, as we talked about in the earlier video, who was a military and political leader during the French Revolution, had surprisingly proclaimed himself Napoleon I, Emperor of France, and coronated himself. And he begins what become known as the Napoleonic Wars, which were a series of military campaigns that were launched in order to conquer all of the bordering nations. And by 1812, he had conquered or established allies with he had conquered or had become allied with most of the European mainland nations and had moved campaigns into the Middle East and into Northern Africa as well. And he used propaganda. We've already looked at it a little bit. We already touched on that some with what he was doing with David, who he sort of saw as his own personal artist in his pocket. But he was a brilliant propagandist. He used art as a means to convince soldiers to fight for him, because he'd already seen how well that worked in his days during the Revolution, to advertise his power, to portray himself as a kind and humanitarian ruler. And one could argue about it, but for the most part, no, I mean, Napoleon is not particularly known for being kind and benevolent, or humanitarian for that matter, right? He was completely unprovoked, declaring war on everyone around him and trying to invade everybody on the continent. But again, he needs to have a good image for the people. So propaganda art it is. He, interestingly, continued the academy salons. So that was one thing that remained in place, the Royal Academy. And the exhibitions became even more of a government institution. Now, by 1815, the British defeated Napoleon. King Louis the 18th, the 18th was reinstated, and Napoleon was placed in exile as a war criminal, and France found themselves right back at square one. After everything that they fought for in the French Revolution, they found themselves underneath a dictator. Finally, they get the dictator kicked out, and the monarchy is put back in place. A constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless. Now, getting back to the academy salons and those exhibitions becoming even more important, an important thing here is that Napoleon liked both the neoclassical artwork in France and the romantic artwork in France, and he was a patron of both, and he influenced the Royal Academy and the salons to start allowing in some of the romantic artists. All right, so this is a map of Europe at the time of Napoleon at his height. Everything that we see in green, dark green, or light green are the empire, or at least areas that were under Napoleon's control. You look at that. Spain, all the way through France, up into the Netherlands. This area over here that would have been which is part of modern day Germany, Switzerland, all of Italy again. And then we have in blue all the states that have allied with the French Empire. In pink, we have those countries that set themselves up as directly in opposition of France. And then, though it's not really showcased here, but he made movements into the Ottoman Empire. You can see this line right here. This is one of the one of the wars that he led into Egypt and into Palestine, and managed to gain a little bit of control in those areas as well. And we already looked a little bit at this guy, Jean-Auguste Dominique ENG, earlier in this lecture. But here we're going to go ahead and dive into him. Now, we just spent all that time talking about the Romantics, right? And now we got to talk about somebody who was a French neoclassical painter, but he is on the scene at the same time as the Romantics. And so he becomes kind of an interesting character. He was trained in the David-esque academic style of the time, traveled and painted in Rome and Florence, developed a style that he believed to be truer, quote unquote, to the ancient Greek classicism. I understand I particularly like specifically Jean-Auguste Dominique ENG's drawings. They are inspiration to my own drawings. He was very full of himself, however. He was influenced by Raphael and other high Renaissance artists. So he is looking back at the high Renaissance. The high Renaissance was looking back at ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So it only really makes sense. He was a director of the French Academy in Rome because he wanted so badly to be a high-ranking official in the French Academy that finally, once he was given this opportunity to go be the director of the French Academy in Rome, it wasn't the same as being a high-ranking member in France itself, but he took it. It finally meant he had arrived. And he became influential on later modernists, particularly one that we'll talk about when we get to modern art, Edgar Degas. He was known for, among other things, his Orientalist paintings of nude women. Now, that's a term that I would also write down if I were in your shoes. Orientalists, or Orientalism. That, we'll talk about it when we get to it, when we see it happen. All right? Just as a reminder, this is the guy we're talking about, right? He's the one who painted this piece of Napoleon on his imperial throne. This is probably the painting of his that you are familiar with, because this painting is ubiquitous, right? It is very well known around the world, the Grand Obelisk. And he painted this in 1814. It showcases, at least to a certain extent, just how caught between the neoclassical ideology and the Romantic ideology that ENG was. And by the way, I know it's spelled, it looks like it should be Ingres. It's French, so his last name is ENG. And ENG is painting this in a very neoclassical manner. The color palette is very neoclassical. The very hard-edged, crisp style is very neoclassical. But he's got subject matter that's very romantic in nature. Right? He seems to be appealing at least to that same draw toward exotic subjects that the Romantics were drawn to. And to a certain extent, that was because the public was very interested in that kind of thing. So an odalisque is a woman in a Turkish harem. That would have been considered exotic if you were a 19th century white dude from France, right? But look at her. She sure is, for someone who's supposed to be Turkish, she sure is lily white, isn't she? She's surrounded with all the trappings that, again, would have seemed extremely exotic if you were a white dude in Europe at the time, right? The bed clothes, the extravagant embroidery and sheets, the sort of feather duster that she's holding, the over here to the right, the hookah that's set up here, the fact that she's nude and unashamed of it, the fact that she would be part of a harem, which to European dudes would have been like, oh my goodness, that's so dirty and so naughty, right? But he's still not willing to go the full distance to paint her with the markers of the ethnicity that she would have been coming from the region that she would be coming from. Instead, he makes her a little more safe. He paints her as this lily white young woman that would have been considered sort of classically beautiful to Europeans of the time. Another interesting thing that he's done here is that many people have noted that he made the Grand Odalisques back. Like there have been people who have like scientifically measured this, and she should have like at least 2 extra vertebrae in that extremely long back of hers, right? Which also kind of goes counter to the neoclassical way that he was trained. So it seems like he always had this little bit of a flirtation with Romanticism while never quite going all the way there. In fact, in 1824, which is when this painting is released, he decides because he's not getting the respect that he believes that he deserves, and so he goes back to his very neoclassical roots with this particular painting, The Vow of Louis XIII, and is finally accepted into one of the salons. He's accepted into the salon of 1824 with this piece, which is a depiction of the story as it goes that Louis XIII, who's quite a ways back in history at this point, who devoted his new kingdom to the Virgin Mary, swore a vow to devote his new kingdom to the Virgin Mary. So we get Louis the 13th down here, draped in the fleur-de-lis, the classic symbol of France, while up above the Virgin Mary, baby Jesus in the clouds as these angels sort of part the curtains, right? And he is completely and utterly referring back to an old painting from a good 300 years prior by Raphael from the High Renaissance Madonna and Child with 2 Angels. Look at that scene up there at the top, right? That Mary and this Mary are no doubt based on one another. The compositions are even extremely similar, right? Like we see the influence that he's taking from Raphael. And he would say that is the right way to do it. Now, I also want to bring up this particular piece of his because it's another one. This one, interestingly enough, done very late in his life in 1862, the Turkish Bath. Because again, it's one of his Orientalist paintings. Oh, I forgot to define Orientalism. All right, Orientalism. This is a trend amongst European artists, writers, music composers, what have you, those involved in the arts, of looking to what were considered quote unquote more primitive cultures. That the term Oriental we often hear as a very insensitive term for people who are from Asia. But at this particular moment in time, it would have been referred to as the Middle and Near East. Turkey, Iran, Iraq, the Israel, maybe down into Egypt as well, and it was looking toward that as an exotic place, but also as a place that is more primitive and as such something to be admired, because there's something that those people must be in touch with that we are no longer in touch with because we have advanced to this point that we have advanced to, right? It's problematic way of thinking about it, right? But this was a thing at the time. And audiences were hungry for paintings that exhibited these exotic people and places. And ENG was willing to give that to us. But again, look at just how much really white skin there is in what is supposed to be a Turkish bath, right? Now, the reason I bring this up is because we're going to see a contrast to it, but also because we're going to get to some things that are going to happen in the modern era that I want to call your attention back to this piece when we get there. All right. Oh, yeah, that's the end of that one. Okay, so, so next, in the next and final section here of this lecture, we're going to get into ENG's argument with a young up-and-coming artist who was very much a romantic. And the story of these two guys and the way they clashed heads, I absolutely love. All right, I'll see you there.